Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you this morning, and especially to give you the greetings of the students and the faculty of the Starr King School for the Ministry. The students especially have been gratified to learn of your interest and respect for Thomas Starr King. I'm sorry to tell you that some of our students are in the position of explaining to confused friends and family that they are not spending tuition money on a school named for an astrological metaphor. So, gratitude for keeping Thomas Starr King's precious memory alive. So I've been excited not only to talk about Thomas Starr King, but specifically to talk to you about his theology of democracy. I've chosen this topic very deliberately. For one, I think the mixture of religious and political power that was Thomas Starr King points to a number of things unique about him, and it also speaks volumes about his success in the public sphere, especially for that which he is most often remembered, his saving of California for the Union. More about that metaphor later. But I also thought it would be instructive to see how Starr King's theology allowed for his religious and his political concerns to be so closely connected. This being something noteworthy from our 21st century point of view, which assumes something closer to a hermeneutic of suspicion regarding religion and the public sphere. But we would not want to miss how it was that Starr King managed to speak to his audiences from inside of a kind of American civil religion in which the civil and the religion were mutually reinforcing. And furthermore, I think that Thomas Starr King's theology is one of the least discussed things about him. So many works focus on his power as a person and his personality, his generosity as a friend, as an activist, and of course his amazing charisma as a speaker, the charisma that captured all of California and the nation itself. So many speak of his animation, but fewer speak of what religiously animated him. But finally, though, I chose this special topic as a historian of Unitarianism who's very mindful of the questions where I most frequently encounter intersections between American Unitarian and American Masonic concerns. What does it mean to engage in a national democracy while also understanding democracy not just as the competition of individual and private interests, but a kind of expression of common good? To put it in an entirely different way, what does it mean to engage in political behaviors as people who would nonetheless primarily self-define in relationship to ultimate concerns? But perhaps I'm only thinking of one of the core teachings of Thomas Starr King, articulated in an early lecture on George Washington, in which he reminded his listeners that if history and time have deprived us of the company of certain great people, we can still learn what we can of their character and their career, and we can take that as incentive to our own devotions. Think what you will about Starr King's theology and politics. Nobody can mistake the fervent passion with which he served his ideals. So I think I'd like to begin with the oddest and most incongruent part of Starr King's theology, which was his fascinating conception of the afterlife. On one hand, Thomas Starr King's understanding of heaven was entirely conventional within a 19th century mainstream, if liberal, American Protestantism. He believed very much in a personal and loving God, and he understood that upon death he would be restored into full relationship with that God. Not that God had ever abandoned his people. Rather, Starr King understood that as a consequence of the complexities of mortal life, living people would lose the capacity, especially when doing wrong, to discern the presence of this loving God. One was always in relationship with God, but death would remove all the impediments for fully appreciating God's presence. For although he came to be in some ways informed by transcendentalism, Starr King never modified his belief in a highly personal God, as many co-religionists of his generation did. His God was always personally knowable. He did not so much believe in God as he felt God's love. In this way, his theism did depart somewhat from some of the other Unitarians of the time, who sometimes rightly and sometimes wrongly were accused of having gone to an icy abstractness in their theology. Not that Starr King was completely removed from the transcendentalist influence. Some have written of his proto-transcendentalist appreciation for nature, but I think I see him closest to transcendentalism in his complete trust of the personal and inner voices of emotion, love, intuition, and experience. But yet, for all of his trust in God, Starr King had serious concerns about heaven. Specifically, he was panicked that it might prove terrifically boring. Here's what he said. The conception of heaven as an interminable singing school and its business a never-ending and monotonous chant directly in the blaze of God's holiness has little to attract the thought of strong men towards it. And seriously, I believe that it is the poverty of imagination in the church as to the conditions, the duties, and the joys of the future world, which accounts in larger measure for the little care that there is about it. For the undertone of feeling, which I know exists in many breasts, that an eternal life, according to the modes of presentation in the church, is not worth having and would be insufferably tedious. A world for the exercise of the great powers of our humanity, and therefore a world more real, more intense, more vital than this plane of existence. We must think of its occupations and business as appealing to and attesting to the distinguishing faculties of our manhood and womanhood, and then perhaps it would be bearable. So fascinating that in speaking about the afterlife, which he did on many and diverse occasions, both publicly and to his congregations, he always employed these same set of words: exercise, duty, service, business, and occupation. What excited him most about heaven was not some state of repose or eternal contentment, which the historic church had promised. For him, the afterlife would be meaningless if it wasn't an opportunity to exercise his powers in service and duty, to be ever about heaven's business and occupation. While this point of view speaks loudly about Starr King's passions and deep commitments, it does, of course, raise a certain theological issue. What precisely is the unfinished business that properly belongs to the occupations of heaven? I'm reminded here of a view held by fellow Unitarian Florence Nightingale, who Dr. Matthews also mentioned, who, operating a little earlier than Starr King, but with equal energy, imagined heaven as a hospital full of wounded soldiers requiring expert nursing. The historian Lytton Strachey, in his famously unflattering portrait of Nightingale, attributed her view of the afterlife to her excessive moral righteousness, something he felt caused her to have grandiose expectations of herself, which in turn caused her to flatly deny her own humanity and any attendant weakness. Thomas Starr King did have very grandiose expectations of himself. It was not uncommon among Unitarians of that time and previous times. I believe part of it is a bit of the inheritance of the Puritan culture, which Dr. Matthews alluded to. And of course, the most common story that we tell about Starr King is that how he worked himself knowingly to death for the cause of the Union. But you know what? I suspect his understanding of that work was a little different than Florence Nightingale's. If nothing else, he had a very keen sense of human eccentricities. He reveled in them, and teasing them out was a source of joy and for his famously excellent humor. There's a nice story about a practicable person who once confronted Starr King with the suspicion that the many stories he told were embellished in order to make them more amusing. This person was concerned that that was a trait unbefitting a clergyman. This person said, "Mr. King, I was present at the occasion about which you are speaking, and I saw nothing of the sort happen." To which Starr King apparently replied, twinkle in the eye, "Aye, but don't you wish you could have been to that event?" But it is true that while it was softened with humor, Starr King did feel that human potential was vast and that developing it was an explicitly religious duty. Jesus stood for him as the ideal embodiment of a perfected humanity. He displayed all those capacities and virtues which any human being could realize, if less perfectly. The godly individual then was one who engaged in constant improvements, one ever expanding their capacity for service. In this way, Starr King's Jesus was the familiar American liberal Protestant teacher and example to humanity. But in another way, he went further. In his understandings, the followers of Jesus haven't simply learned from him. They carry within them something of a divinizing power of godly purpose, of mission. Here are his words. Christ did not say that his truth was the salt of the earth, but that his teachers themselves were. Truth was embodied, or rather ensouled, in those men. The Word made flesh in him, and it was to be the Word made flesh to some extent in those humble and unlettered persons that redeeming influence, persevering life, was to be diffused throughout the world. Starr King, serving a Unitarian church in Boston without the benefit of a college degree, had every reason to feel affinity for those unlettered disciples, both in their humble estate but also in the glorious radiance of their mission. And so, of course, California would be the choice for his second ministry. Of course, he would need to leave New England. As one of his biographers wrote, the old Greek philosopher divined the universe as a becoming. The old cities of the United States had already become. California, when he entered it, was in a state of flux, was becoming, as indeed was Starr King himself, becoming. Dr. Rich mentioned earlier that we each have our own ideas about whether people are formed by history or if history formed people. I like this particular quote about becoming because I would like to think that the greatest historical agents are those who enter in a deep dialogue with history and their own agency. And Starr King certainly did that. So California offered the greater challenge, and so California became the religious choice. Only California and Starr King could enter into a kind of dialogue where they might mutually call each other to the greater accomplishment that he felt was his explicitly religious duty. Well, and what was this enlivening mission to be? It was to advance something that we might call America or democracy, although for Starr King it always existed under a larger theological umbrella than any earthly polity. Starr King assumed that the ultimate end of all earthly efforts would be the establishment of a new social order, marked by complete equality, a kind of kingdom of God ushered in by an age of mutual respect and equity. All races, all creeds, nations, and individuals essentially already held citizenship in this world that would come, whose unity was absolute. Democracy would lead the way, but in the end it would dissolve into an even more equitable government, something that he called an organization of love. I found this a fascinating thing to think of, this suggestion that love might be a form of polity, or that polity might be a form of love. But consequently, Starr King saw patriotism as a good, but it wasn't the ultimate or at least the final good. Most of his contemporaneous biographers seem to have agreed with him on this. In the words of one, it was the noblest implications of the Civil War that it should have stirred in the breast of a multitude of men and women to whom until that crucial house disinterested in altruistic sentiments were comparatively unknown, a sense of personal duty to the common weal, a devotion to the ideals of liberty, justice, and humanity, which lifted them above their own sordid interests and narrow sympathies. Patriotism then was a kind of relational training ground, a means of accustoming people to extend their energy and their devotion to causes larger than themselves. Patriotism as a love of country was a training in a love that could be taught to expand infinitely. Starr King's patriotism then, as fervent as it was not narrow. he would have never been able to say, "My country, right or wrong," if there was an injustice. Hence, his specifically theological case against successionism. In one of his widely popular speeches, Starr King explained that the Confederacy was the treacherous thread in the warp and the weave of the American flag. The Confederate attempt to deny the unity of the United States was the sign of its error. Larger entities were, in essence, better, more inclusive, more loving, more indicative of a larger justice to come. Hence, his repeated use of images that suggested that succession was not just undesirable, but impossible. Division and destruction for him were one and the same. One story he liked to tell about this was about a ship owned by two different warring individuals. One of those individuals imagines that the way to resolve the disagreement about the ship's ultimate destination was to divide the ship in two. The strategy of this metaphor was very typical for him. Understanding how this theology of unity reveals how Starr King managed to combine his abolitionism with his vehement pro-union stance. As early before the war, the two were not always natural friends. In the days immediately prior to the Civil War, it was sometimes said that Unionists feared succession more than they disliked slavery. At the same time, many abolitionists were not necessarily Unionists. They were sometimes willing to say that if the right hand offend, cut it off. Furthermore, radical abolitionism was frightening to many moderate pro-union persons, including many Unitarians of the time, for its willingness to suggest that slavery was so great a wrong as to merit the radical and violent rending of the social fabric. Especially for persons schooled in a 19th century natural theology that was taught at Harvard, that implied certain consistencies between natural law, divine intentions, human moral capacity, and social order. This was a concerning notion. All of these persons acknowledged the enormous sinfulness of slavery, and yet they remained confused about what strategies were appropriate to remedy the injustice. Thomas Starr King's theology of democracy resolved a great deal of that tension, helping to explain how he managed to be explicitly abolitionist without suffering the consequences of too much disapproval from less progressive congregants. In his rewriting of the Union cause, supporting the equal rights of all persons was the same thing as promoting the larger and somewhat extent divinely ordained social order, the organization of love. This too explains why Starr King felt no qualms about intruding on the public sphere with his religious arguments. The questions up for discussion regarding the unity of the country and the equality of its citizens did not suggest to him that he was intruding religion on politics. He did not think it was a matter of rending unto Caesar the things that were Caesar's, but rather taking away from Caesar the things that were obtaining to God. The secular powers and the principalities, in his mind, had no right to assign relative weight to different human souls. So here I'd like to circle back to where I opened this discussion, which was an understanding of Thomas Starr King's conception of death. But this time I'd like to contextualize that with a reflection on his own death and how his own death was understood. For one cannot understand Starr King without understanding the weight of feeling that was projected onto his death. If Starr King understood himself to be on a divine mission, others certainly agreed with him, describing his death as a kind of martyrdom. More overtly, he's frequently spoken of as having saved California from the Union. And actually, I just had a conversation with Dr. Matthews why this is everywhere said. We can nowhere track it to a specific person. So why he's frequently spoken as having saved California for the Union, with the deliberate conflation there of the spiritual and political senses of redemption, how did he save California for the Union? The answer, according to the popular legend, is to the point of offering his own life, dying at a young age from intentional self-sacrifice. Here are the words of his biographer, Edward Whipple. As he was ever ready to lay down his own life when the occasion demanded the sacrifice, so was he ready to wear it out at the call of duty by the slow suicide of overwork. He's also described as having suffered compromises to his health as a result of his extraordinarily sensitive and sympathetic nature. Some of this is painful to read from our contemporary point of view, such as when his friends suggest that when Anthony Burns was marched through the street of Boston to be returned to his owner, Starr King suffered more than the fugitive slave himself. But what's important about these images is understanding the degree to which Starr King's supporters and friends clearly understood him as a prophetic figure, a Jesus-like figure of a uniquely American sort. I do not think it too much to say that with Starr King, or perhaps more accurately, a short time after his death, a certain way of embodying American hopes and dreams also died. We must remember that Starr King did not live to see the end of the Civil War, and so in many ways he was a last and glimmering example of a particular kind. For in some ways the Civil War validated a certain experience of America that it had been Starr King's to represent and to affirm. But more than anything, the Civil War was also a profoundly serious trauma that took its tolls not just on the bodies and the hearts of American citizens, but on its culture and its philosophies as well. As Louis Menard has written, the Civil War swept away the slave civilization of the South, but it also swept away the whole intellectual culture of the North along with it. People in democratic societies were not supposed to settle their disagreements by killing each other. Idealisms possible before the war were not possible in the same way after it, and the Civil War helped loosen the hold that the liberal Christian idealism so dear to Thomas Starr King had on American culture. Instead, it ushered in a new era of American pragmatism and skepticism. This latter philosophical tone was nothing as fiery as the idealism that preceded it, but it was deeply felt and expressed honest concerns. What exactly is an ideal like democracy or even equity if it can lead to unthinkable carnage? I think, too, of another co-religion of Thomas Starr King's, the staunch abolitionist Julia Ward Howe. We all remember how filled with passion she was for the cause of the Union side when she wrote the battle hymn of the Republic. How many of us know, however, that after the war, she repented the bold words and the brave tune that had sent so many men to their death. She spent the rest of her life trying to unsuccessfully write a hymn about peace that would enjoy the same success. And when I wonder what it would have been like if Thomas Starr King had lived past the end of the Civil War, I think about his friend, Oliver Wendell Holmes, a fellow Unitarian and Bostonian, a man who, like Starr King, believed very much in the salvific possibilities of edifying culture, which Dr. Matthews spoke about. Certainly part of Starr King's technique for adhering California to the Union was to present the great New England poets to California, and thereby establishing a firm west-east tie, a common literary vocabulary for what America could be. And yet this simple affirmation of the redemptive power of refined culture was impossible to sustain with the same optimism after the war. Oliver Wendell Holmes had served with distinction in the Union Army. He watched many of his friends die. He was wounded several times, and once he was left behind enemy lines with a wound in the neck, expected to die. Here's Louis Menard again, with a description of Holmes's experience after the war. He had grown up in a highly cultivated, homogeneous world, a world of which he was in so many ways the perfect product, idealistic, artistic, and socially committed. And then he watched that world bleed to death in a war that learning and brilliance had been powerless to prevent. When he returned, Boston had changed, and so had American life. Holmes had changed too, but he never forgot what he had lost. He said that after the Civil War, the world never seemed right again. Again, Starr King did die before it became impossible to ignore such questions as Wendell Holmes had to confront. Starr King certainly had what centuries of Christian history would describe as a good death. He was aware enough of his fate to comment upon his own predicament, to say a calm farewell to friends, family, and his wife, and to leave some edifying last words for the ages. His doctor told him, when he'd become seriously ill, that he only had a half an hour to live. At that point, King glanced at a calendar and said, "Today is the 4th of March. Sad news will go over the wire today." He then calmly dictated his will and turned to his wife. "Do not weep for me," he said. "I know it's all right. I wish I could make you feel so. I wish I could describe my feelings. It is strange. I see all the privileges and the greatness of the future. It already looks grand and beautiful. Tell them I went lovingly, trustingly, and peacefully." I think we cannot forget to continually to ask ourselves this question: are we as grand and as beautiful as Starr King imagined?